It's 4:30 and I'm looking for the clock, but we'll make a start. You can see I'm out of practice. I couldn't even switch the microphone on without being reminded. Anyway, I'd like to begin by welcoming those members of the public, if anybody's on YouTube, and press who are in attendance and those watching the live stream of this meeting via Council's YouTube page. Also welcome some of our new members to the Audit Committee. I'm sure you'll have a great time over the next year or so and understand where the real power with regards to money actually lies. A few housekeeping rules before we begin. If members of the public in attendance need to use the facilities, these are located back through reception in the main foyer by the coffee shops. If there is a fire alarm, please leave the building by the nearest fire exit and make your way to the concourse, which is located just before the multi-storey car park. As a reminder to members of the committee and those in attendance, please can you all keep your masks on unless you're due to speak or invited to do so by myself, at which point you can remove your mask and speak into the microphone. Item number 1, apologies for absence. Are there any apologies?
Thank you, Chair. I have no apologies of absence received.
Thank you. Declarations of interest. Does any member wish to declare any disclosable pecuniary interest or non-statutory disclosable interest? If so, please can they raise their hand now? Nope, that's it. Item 3, audit of statement of accounts. To those charged with governance, please can I ask Pete Carpenter, Kirsty Nutton and the Ernst & Young, in EY to introduce the report.
Thank you, Chair, and welcome everyone to Audit Committee. An interesting committee, and just remind everyone there's Audit Committee training tomorrow night. Just to remind everyone. Good. Right. This is a recommendation to Audit Committee, and this, for those that have been on the committee for quite a while, will realise that this is the third time I think that we've looked at the audit of accounts. We've looked at it originally in July, then again in November. We had an update in January. The recommendations of this report are to receive and approve the audit results report from our external auditors, Ernst & Young, to note the amendment to the inclusion of a post-balance sheet live event, and to receive and allow Councillor Over and myself to sign the management representation letter and the audited statement of accounts after you've questioned us on anything you feel relevant. We are hoping that basically after the committee tonight we will do a number of electronic signatures. First Councillor Over and myself, and then our external auditors, which means that hopefully at some stage later this evening the accounts are finally signed off. Okay. I think at that point, Neil, over to you.
Thank you, Pete, and good afternoon, members of the Audit Committee. So I appreciate the timing of the papers, so can I just take that members of the Audit Committee have received the supplementary papers in your pack, which is the final audit results report from ourselves, which draws to a conclusion our audit of the Council's financial statements for the 2019-20 financial year, and also the conclusion we reach on the adequacy of the Council's arrangements for value for money and its use of resources, which is set by the Code of Practice from the National Audit Office. The supplementary paper you have from EY is obviously a very lengthy document, and what it does is it seeks to bring for completeness our final audit results report. But what I've sought to do in the executive summary in the first few pages of this document is to set out what has changed since the reports that were taken in both November 20, but also our executive summary on the 25th of January. And just before I do so, I do want to thank officers of the Council for all the cooperation and assistance that I and my team have had throughout the external audit of the City Council's financial statements. Members of this committee be all too aware of the financial challenges that are facing the Council, which we have reported on extensively at previous audit committees and are bringing back to you today. But one of the other reasons why the audit opinion was not issued at the end of last year is because of considerations as to whether the Council's financial arrangements with Empower Community Limited should give Community Management LLP should give rise to any adjusting post-balance sheet events in light of decisions that the Council was taking post-balance sheet around the financing arrangements with Empower Community Management LLP and other circumstances that we became aware of before the end of March 2021. So if I may, members, I'll just take you through my executive summary. I will take the rest of the report as read, and the rest of the report hasn't changed significantly from what you've received from me before. So in terms of the first page of the letter I'm setting out covering the audit results report, we're now saying that subject to your consideration of the final set of audited financial statements and management's representation letter, we are now in a position to issue our audit opinion. And that audit opinion will be an unqualified opinion on the Council's financial statements, in that the financial statements represent a true and fair view of the authority's financial position as at the 31st of March 2020. We will also be including in our audit report a reference to the Council's going concern disclosure note at note 44 of the financial statements, in which we think the Council does appropriately report material uncertainties associated with the continuity of service provision, looking at least 12 months forward from the date of these accounts. And what that means in practice is that the Council is recognising the serious financial challenges that it has. It has recognised the conditional capitalisation directions recently determined by MHCLG, but that still gives rise to a material uncertainty on the continuity of service provision, just because of the nature of and significance of the budget gap that the Council faces. You'll also note in our statutory audit report we're referring to both note 22 and note 43 of the financial statements, and we're providing an emphasis of matter on the Council's description of the material uncertainty facing property valuations in respect of the impact of COVID-19. We believe, again, the disclosures in the Council's audited accounts are appropriate to those circumstances, and we draw attention to that in an emphasis of matter. Now, whilst we're referring to material uncertainties and emphasis of matter associated with going concern and valuation of the Council's asset base, it's important to say that our audit opinion has not been qualified for these matters. We've not modified our audit report. We're drawing attention to what we believe to be very appropriate disclosures that the Council's made in the audited accounts, but they are significant nonetheless for us to draw attention to them in our audit report. And finally, in terms of the statutory audit report, we are issuing a qualified conclusion on the authority's arrangements for securing value for money in its use of resources. Now, again, this qualification has been trailed at previous committee meetings. The conclusion that is set out in our report remains the same as what we reported in November and again in January. And we are recognising that whilst the authority has responded appropriately to its deteriorating financial position and has made appropriate representations to MHCLG and appropriate disclosures within the financial statements, nonetheless we still have, and still do at the point at which we're issuing our report today, significant concerns on the authority's current and future financial sustainability. And we are making it clear that without a comprehensive package of either additional government funding support or significant unplanned reductions in services, we believe the authority's weak financial position does have a pervasive and fundamental impact on its ability to secure ongoing value for money in its use of resources, and therefore we're expressing that qualified conclusion. In concluding our audit, we, in our January meeting, we did make members of this committee aware that we were still considering the recoverability of the Council's £23 million loan to Empower Community Management LLP. In the draft set of accounts, the loan was recognised as a short-term debtor of £23 million. And throughout the course of the audit, I, as the partner in charge, I did challenge the classification of that being a short-term debtor, because a short-term debtor suggests that's recoverable in less than 12 months. And I was seeking to understand the conditions in place prior to our audit opinion that amount would be recoverable. Obviously, in undertaking our inquiries, we became aware of further actions and decisions that the Council was taking to refinance that arrangement with Empower Community Management LLP, to such an extent that led to a long-term financing arrangement at a rate of 2.5% over 15 years. Now, we undertook work before the end of March 2021 to satisfy ourselves that revised financing agreement would be recoverable over the term of the loan. And we did do, from our stress testing, we did take the view that would be recoverable over that period of time. However, before the end of March, we were made aware that under the memorandum of understanding before the finance agreement was signed off, there had been a default by Empower Community Management LLP to one payment, one quarterly payment of that loan repayment. And as a result, in discussions with the officers, I think appropriate actions were then taken to revisit both the recoverability of that loan, but also what decisions the council wished to take before that finance agreement was signed off. And I don't wish to go through a significant amount of detail on that, because I understand the decision-making papers associated with the future options with the arrangement the council has with Empower Community Management LLP have been the subject of a cabinet meeting this morning. But in terms of the financial statements, we needed to take a view whether those conditions led to what's called an adjusting post-balance sheet event. And there's been a lot of activity that's been undertaken by both Deloitte, acting as advisors to the council, to undertake an expected credit loss assessment, which is required under international financial reporting standards, to determine what the value is of that facility if it was to be subject to a sale at this particular point in time, to determine the extent of impairment that could be recognised, but also the other options if the council was to bring that facility back in-house or to continue with the long-term financing arrangements with Empower Community Management LLP. Now, we've undertaken a significant amount of work to review the specialist advice that's been provided by Deloitte, and we believe the discounted cash flow model that's been provided is appropriate to recognise an accounting adjustment within the financial statements. The question then was what discount rate is being used on that facility. And under the Code of Practice for Local Government Financial Reporting, it refers to the use of an effective interest rate. Now, we take the view in EY that the effective rate of interest should be what we're aware of now, which is 2.5%, subject to any further decision that the council is likely to take. But in terms of the probability of outcomes, we thought that 2.5% was an appropriate rate of interest to use to discount that loan over the 15-year period. The council have used a rate of 2.1%, which would represent the council's weighted average cost of capital, on the grounds that if the council are bringing the arrangements for the asset management of the solar panel assets in-house, that would be the cost of carrying those assets and the cost of capital. Now, the difference between an adjustment representing 2.1% and an adjustment representing 2.5% is just over 600,000 and is not material to our audit opinion. But what has happened is the council has made a post-balance sheet event adjustment for discounting at 2.1% therefore, and reclassified the loan to a long-term debtor. And we believe both adjustments are appropriately recognised now in the audited accounts. However, you will note, if you turn over to page 2 of my covering report, that
Thank you. I just wanted to ask, what are your thoughts on discounting at even the higher rate of 2.5%? Empower isn't exactly a multinational company, and you've stated that it's already defaulted on a quarterly payment. By that token, what kind of credit rating would you assign to it? And then what would be an appropriate discount rate for a company that's got a similar credit rating?
So we have to look at it. We look at it on the basis of what interest rate has been agreed with the organisation, but also what other options, what the probability weighted outcomes would be of other options. So, for example, the council bringing the assets in-house, and we don't think that difference between 2.1% and 2.5% for the purposes of accounting are leading to any risk of a material misstatement. What the Deloitte also did is they looked into what would take place if the council had no choice but to sell that interest, so and to look for an outside provider to buy out the arrangements, and that was at a rate of just over 6% of that was discounted, and the enterprise value then of that facility was 15.4 million, and that's been disclosed appropriately in the notes to the accounts. But the reason why that adjustment has not been made to 15.4 million is that we think it's very unlikely that the council would be selling that facility on a commercial basis, and therefore we think it's appropriate that the effective rate of interest that should be used is either between 2.1 or 2.5%, which is what the council's entered into as a financing arrangement, and therefore we think the adjustment in the accounts is appropriate, but the disclosure appropriately sets out what a worst case scenario would look like.
Yeah, I appreciate that the worst case scenario would look like something between the 2.1 and the 2.5%. I guess my challenge is, you mentioned IFRS. Under IFRS, you have to take a market value of loans, and the market value of loans is determined by the creditworthiness of the counterparty. And it sounds to me like the creditworthiness of this counterparty is not particularly strong, given that it has already defaulted. So would it not be more prudent to recognise it at a higher rate of interest? A higher discount rate?
Well, as I say, I think we took the view it would be discounted at the 2.5 rather than 2.1. I think the standards also refer to the probability weighted outcomes, and that's looking at various options. So that I from all the specialist advice that the council has got, and from the work that I've undertaken, it's very unlikely that that facility would be sold to an external provider. So therefore, whilst the disclosure refers appropriately to what would happen if it was to happen, so for example 15.4 million, actually we believe the adjustment for the period up to the 31st of March 2020 has been appropriately impaired by an amount that's just over £2 million, which we think is appropriate.
Okay, and then, sorry, just finally, ultimately then, has this facility been recognised as a short-term debtor or a long-term debtor, given that the council are in discussions with trying to restructure the loan?
So at the point, so this is looking at the balance sheet date of the 31st of March 2020. Yeah. So at that particular point in time, I took the view that the conditions at this point suggested that was still a long-term debtor. Yeah. But when you then look at the position at the 31st of March 2021, when we turn to the 2021 audit of accounts, then there is a further question as to actually whether those circumstances and conditions have changed again. And our note does go on to say on page 2 of my letter the various recommendations that we think the council needs to take, one of which is depending on the decisions that have been taken today and going forward, if the council were to bring this arrangement in-house, there would need to be a valuation of those assets and then determine whether there needs to be a further impairment recognised at the point at which the council has an up-to-date valuation of those assets. If the council were to continue with the long-term financing arrangement, then we would expect another expected credit loss assessment to be done for the purposes of the 2021 financial statements.
So just to clarify then, it has been recognised as a short-term debtor in the balance sheet as at 2020?
No, long-term debtor.
Long-term debtor?
Yeah.
Okay, appreciate that. Okay, thank you.
Are you okay if I continue? Yep. So on page 2, and thank you for the questions, I think I've covered in my answer quite a lot of what I'm saying on the second page, but we have made some recommendations to the council about where steps need to be taken to consider the outcome of the decision making that's happening right now associated with the arrangements with Empower Community Management LLP, and what has been learnt through this process of getting to the stage today, whether there is a recognised impairment and a decision around that facility in the future. And the recommendations that we're making is that the council just reviews any similar financing arrangements that it has to ensure that there isn't any further risk exposure to itself of further financial loss from other similar arrangements, that the council reviews the appropriateness of its minimum revenue provision for capital loans in light of these events. And as I've already mentioned in answer to the question from the councillor, if the council brings this arrangement in-house, then it obtains an up-to-date valuation of the assets as soon as practicable. I think that's an important step because the council needs to ensure what exposure it might have around the asset management arrangements, and an up-to-date valuation enables it to do so. But for financial reporting purposes, we also need that information to determine whether there is any adjusting events for the 2021 accounts when we get there, because you need to recognise that the 21st of June 2021 is actually in the 21-22 financial year. So if the council were to bring the assets in-house, it's when those asset valuations are recognised for financial reporting purposes, and we need to take a view when we get to the 2021 audit whether that is an adjusting event for 2021 or this is recognised in the 21-22 accounts. We do set out in on page 2 that we can see some weaknesses in the governance arrangements and decision making associated with the Empower Community Management LLP arrangements for the 2021 financial year. The specialist work that was undertaken to support me and my team did identify that there were aggressive assumptions in the revised financing arrangement. The Council, in its decision-making papers, have also recognised those aggressive assumptions and the mitigations that are set out on this page as to why that is the case. But we do draw attention to the fact that entering into what we believed was an aggressive facility did put the Council at risk, and therefore we do believe that there are some lessons to be learned from what's happened here that the Council should put in place to avoid anything like this happening again in the future. And then on, and if you're okay for me to conclude, if I turn then on to page 3 of my letter, at the previous audit committees we've highlighted the scale of the financial challenge facing the Council. This has been openly disclosed in your audited financial statements, both in the narrative report but in the going concern disclosure note. We've reported extensively on the work we've undertaken as your auditors and the value for money conclusion. But I did promise to members of this committee that I would provide some further output of the work that was undertaken for us from specialists that have been supporting me to stress test the Council's budget and medium-term financial plan, and those are set out on pages 9 to 14 of your papers. They show stress testing of the Council's budget and medium-term financial plan prior to the award of capitalisation directions from MHCLG, but nonetheless I think it's important that you're aware of this because it puts into context the scale of the challenge. And there are, I suppose, 2 key messages I would say from this. The first is that the base case scenario that's included in the Council's budget and medium-term financial plan was broadly consistent with the work that our specialists had undertaken. That should give you confidence on the figures that are being provided to you from the officers about the scale of the challenge and the steps that the Council is taking. That's also corroborated by the fact that we looked at the Council's savings and transformation plan prior to COVID-19 and determined that those were appropriate. But you'll see that we've stress tested those scenarios under more protracted recovery from COVID-19, a deeper recession, and what that might mean for the size of the Council's budget gap. And you'll see under a scenario 3 just how big that gap could go to under a worst case scenario. And we'll be revisiting those assumptions as part of our 2021 external audit of the financial statements, our value for money commentary, but also the Council's up-to-date going concern disclosure notes that we'll need to produce later this year. But I hope for you as members of this committee it gives you a lot more information about some of the information that I received during the course of the audit, and I thought it was appropriate to make that available to you today before I concluded the audit. I think with that, Chairman, just before, as part of wrapping up, if I may, as part of the management representation letter that we're getting today, included within the audit results report are a number of uncorrected differences. Individually and collectively these are not material, but for you as members of the committee you need to be aware that there are uncorrected differences and there needs to be representations made to ourselves through the letter of representation as to why the Council is not amending the accounts for those items, which I understand is on the grounds of materiality. We do set out our final position on audit fees within the document, and I'm happy to take any questions on that. And I suppose just finally to conclude, once again a thanks for your attention and forbearance throughout what I know has been a protracted audit and has led to some delays, and for your questioning of me throughout the course of the audit, and once again to the officers for all the cooperation and assistance that we've had during the course of our work this year. And I'll now pause. I won't take you through the rest of the 60-70 pages of this document, but I hope my introduction has given you enough information to take a view on the Council's accounts before we conclude.
Thank you. Just a couple of things that you mentioned towards the end of that. Thank you very much for that. That was a really useful insight into the work that you've done. You mentioned the Council's aggressive assumptions in setting up their base position. Can you just outline what some of those aggressive assumptions were in relation to, and if you're aware of what kind of advice the Council took before selecting those assumptions?
Is that in relation to the budget or the medium term? So I think just to clarify, when I mentioned aggressive assumptions, I was referring to that in the context of the Empower refinancing of the Empower loan. So in terms of the medium term financial strategy, it's important to say that the information that the council's been basing decisions on, the base case, we believe is appropriate, and the council have been very clear with MHCLG and ourselves the risks to its financial position and the options available to the Chief Financial Officer in his statutory role as to whether to exercise a Section 114 report and how close the council is to those actions. We believe that is appropriate, but what we've sought to do during our work is stress test that position and say, well, actually, if there was a deeper recession and went on for longer than you're suggesting, and we threw some downside scenarios into that, what would that do to the underlying financial position? And obviously, understandably, that position would increase.
Yeah, and that was my second question, as you kind of just touched on that. The 3 scenarios that you've tested in the charts that you've produced that run off over the next 5 years, what has informed those 3 scenarios? I appreciate they're trying to cover different levels of market shock and different levels of rate in which we recover from the COVID pandemic. But where were these sourced from, and what were they specifically? Are they detailed in the pack? I didn't see any.
So we draw on publicly available a range of economic and socio-demographic profiles, and we use that information to be able to forecast what we think the level of spend could be and pressures that could be on services within the council over the medium-term financial strategy. So that would look at the socio-demographic profile within Peterborough and where we think the challenges are. And in terms of economic data, we look at GVA forecasts and what our economic experts in EY are telling us about how quickly the economy will, in this particular area and also within the UK, will recover from COVID-19. And I know the council have been using their own economic analysis and forecasting to also form that view for their medium-term financial strategy. But we've used some of that data then to provide some stress testing, so downside scenarios within that. So in each of the pages, we give a top-line summary to say, well, what does that scenario say? So scenario 2 shows a sharper recession with a sharper recession during 2021, but a quick economic recovery afterwards. And scenario 3 is a more protracted recession with economic recovery not occurring until next year.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. This is probably more aimed at Peter's team, really. EY have recommended that we review any financial arrangements we have similar to Empower. Are there many to review?
Thank you, Chair. I think I have a couple questions more aimed at Pete, I think. So the first one being about the statement of accounts. On page 94, it's about impact of COVID-19 on 2021, 2022 and future years. It states that one of the pressures identified is inability to achieve £5.6 million of the savings that the council expected to in the current year, which creates a pressure in year and next financial year. What long-term impact do you think this will have on the budget in the years ahead?
We actually talked about this in the Audit Report today,
On the 12th of next month. When we got to the start of this year in COVID, we had some quite significant savings which couldn't be done because of the impact of affected staff and the delivery of services, and those services became areas that were delivery of COVID responses for the council. Those savings are still not off the agenda. It's just when they are going to be deliverable and to what degree, because we don't know in overall terms when we'll be out, well, when we'll be in the first stage of recovery and how many stages there is going to be in recovery to get to a point where we can then start using the savings again and go back to them. So at the moment we have our rapid implementation team looking at a range of savings for the council because we have a 26 million gap for 22-23 to close, and we've also got MHCLG coming in next month to review us in terms of the additional support they've given this year. And one of the questions they'll ask is, and they will look at, is, okay, these savings, when do we think they are deliverable? So they are being reviewed on an active basis all the time. But at the moment, if you look at the outturn report, one of our biggest issues is latent demand, because of COVID, a lot of things haven't happened yet. But as soon as we open up, the care community, in particular adults, children and schools, think that a demand for certain services is going to go quite significantly up, and we don't know how long that's going to go up and if it's going to plateau and when it's going to plateau. So at the moment we've brought forward in terms of reserves £13 million as part of the outturn statement to try and quell that next year. But again, is it going to continue to go up? Will it go up and then plateau? Will it go down potentially after that plateau? And that's what no council knows at the moment.
Thank
and
you.
You'll find that being quite consistent across a number of councils when you look at the outturn reports that you'll see in the next 6 weeks from all councils.
No, thank you. That's really helpful. And I think you said it will be in a report coming 12th, so I look forward to seeing that. My second question refers to page 55 of the final audit results. The assessment of control environment, where it says about one of the control findings identified in the report is 2 significant contracts which were not held on the contracts register. I was just wondering if you could confirm if the council will be acting on the recommendation in the results to ensure that all significant contracts are recorded on the register going forward, and can you just provide an explanation as to why the 2 contracts weren't recorded?
Okay, we are actually working on that at the moment and have been with Cambridgeshire for the last probably 3 months. As you know, adults and children, which is where the vast majority of our contracts are, is a joint service. So some of the contracts are delivered by us, some of them are delivered by Cambridgeshire in terms of that, and we have to make sure that the right arrangements are in place. A process has been going on for the last few months to make sure everything is picked up in terms of that, and 1 or 2 hadn't been picked up properly because they've been delivered either by one of us or the other. And so that has now been addressed, hopefully, in terms of the list we've got. Everything over a certain threshold, obviously, under that threshold there are local arrangements, but this is, for us, that threshold is £100,000, I think, from memory.
Okay, Councillor Furey.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you, Neil, for your extensive report. But my question is more sort of aimed towards Peter and the team. If we look at page 23 of the supplementary agenda pack, I'll sort of just summarise the statement. It says the authority has amended the loan in the statement of accounts to 20.4 million, recognising an impairment of 2.6 million. In terms of this impairment or bad debt, is that money going to be taken out of services next year in the budget, or are we sort of allocating money from reserves for that to cover that shortfall?
Okay, so thank you, Councillor. Oh, I'm still on. The way it's been dealt with is we have, because it's a capital sum, it's placed against minimum revenue provision over the life of the loan. So there will be a 175k or around that hit for the next 15 years to even it out, which is the right accounting transaction to do it. In terms of the overall transaction, obviously, as part of the other side, and again this was talked about in Cabinet this morning, in terms of the interest made, because this was a development loan initially and was just about to be converted into a long-term loan, we've received a net 4.4 of interest on the revenue side, but it's not apples and pears because we've got an upside on revenue but a downside on capital.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions? Okay, Neil, I've just got a very general one. Over the last 25 years, 23 of them we've had statements of weakness in financial policies, and yet we're still here. And I'm just saying that compared to other councils, how are we actually doing? Are we fairly secure, really, or are we in deep, deep trouble?
So this is my first year as your key audit partner. Obviously, EY have audited Peterborough City Council for a number of years, but my impression is of an organisation that takes very seriously your responsibilities on financial reporting, financial management, and probity. You have been very open and transparent about all of the particular concerns and risks that the council faces, and that's made. Whilst you got an extensive report from us, that has made our job in terms of external audit a lot more straightforward about how we deal with those things, because a council that isn't accepting of some of its challenges clearly is more at risk of an auditor exercising their statutory audit powers. However, and I think that's important to say in the context of your control environment for preparing the accounts, the adequacy of systems and processes on your core financial systems, we're not expressing any significant concerns on that. Where we are expressing our significant concerns is on the council's financial standing, which the council would recognise itself. And if you were to ask me how that sits with other councils that I'm aware of or within my portfolio, that sits obviously very high in my portfolio right now. It's one of very few that I'm dealing with where there are such serious concerns, but I come back to the point that those have been openly disclosed to me, and there are always options open to an external auditor as to other action that they should take as part of their statutory role. Obviously all of that really depends on the steps that the council continues to take to address your financial challenges, the appropriate representations that be made to MHCLG, what further mitigations you can take to address your budget gaps, and how openly and transparently you report in that position to the taxpayers of Peterborough. And should there be any further concerns on how I think you're doing that, then I've probably got a duty as the external auditor to take some further action, which would be either a statutory recommendation or a report in the public interest, which, if you're aware of the situation with Croydon and other councils that have had that. But we haven't seen the need to do that here because of the way you've disclosed it and the actions that you have been taking. But am I concerned about your financial position? Yes, I am.
Thank you, Chair. Sorry, just one more aim towards Peter and the team again, if that's okay. In terms of the Empower loan, I understand that this is something we are sort of bringing in-house. Would you say we have the sort of resources and expertise to deal with such a project in-house, or is that something that we'll sort of have an external contract with? And sorry, a part two as well, if I may. In terms of, just from a debt recovery standpoint, as well as that, are we sort of anticipating any profit to be made from this, bringing this in-house, as well as recovery of the loan?
Thank you, Councillor. A couple of queries. So, in terms of the papers that went to Cabinet this morning, we are looking to bring it back in-house in overall terms. We will, obviously, we brought in someone to do a job in the short term to look at bringing that back in-house and the mechanisms to do it, but we will have to tender out for the asset manager to manage it on our behalf, because we don't have that in-house at the moment, and there are others in the market who are available, and Empower can apply to be the asset manager as well. But what I need to prove is that there is value for money in terms of the people who are going to manage this on our behalf, and so there'll be a tender process to deliver that. In terms of the wider situation, as I said earlier, in overall terms, for the transaction from inception till now, in net terms we are up about 4.4 million in terms of interest. There's been some consultants' fees against that. On the capital side, we've got a capital cost of impairment of 2.6 million, and there's 400k of bad debt. So in overall terms, we're around, in cash terms, and I'll say cash, we're about £1 million up, but it's not all apples and pears. It's all apples and pears because some of it is revenue, some of it is capital, and some of it is debt. So just in a roundabout number, that's where it sits at the moment. And again, that's set out in the Cabinet report that went this morning. In terms of looking forward, At the moment, this loan is based on feed-in tariffs or FITs, but are actually quite advantageous. They're part of the initial FITs that were done, and so are quite good. However, that's what the income sources are. One of the potential upsides for us is over the next 5 years, all houses have to have an electric meter, and that's by 2025. What we don't know at the moment is the additional capacity that could be put into the grid and which we could sell peer-to-peer. And so that is a possibility, and then that would be a credit against the council in terms of green energy. And so it's something with our 2030 pledge, which we probably didn't have 2 years ago, but we do now, which could actually be an advantage to us. And again, other sorts of things where we can store energy from the solar panels and where they are, and of course the users take their energy from it, and so this, I think, will go down over time as people charge their cars and everything else through their houses. But we can look at advantageous ways of putting energy into the grid when the grid is at low points of energy, and that's what other people are looking to do with these sort of portfolios. But we need an asset partner that's going to be able to deliver that as well.
Okay, thank you. Are we all through? Yep, okay, thank you. So, thanks members. There are no more questions, therefore I'd like to move to the recommendations. These are to receive and approve the audit result reports for the year ended 31st of March 2020 from Ernst & Young, the Council's external auditors. 2, to note the amendment made for the inclusion of the post-balance sheet event. 3, receive and approve the 2019-20 management representation letter. 4, receive and approve the audited statement of accounts 2019-20. To delegate to the Chairman to approve further changes if needed. To approve the draft annual Audit Committee report for submission to Council as shown in Appendix 1. Members, if you are not in agreement, can you let me know now? Thank you. Members, thanks a lot. The recommendations are therefore agreed. Members, that brings the meeting to a close. Sorry.
And can I just say to members, so we can get it wrapped up today, this is all being done electronically. And I think we just need to minute that.
Yeah, okay.
And obviously it's got Councillor Over's approval for that, and that will be in the minutes.
Okay.
Because our external auditors can then do it electronically on their side today as well, hopefully.
Right. I'd like to thank members and officers in attendance for the